It's the summer of 2018 and we're celebrating 40 years of Space Invaders. We talk about a lot of older games on this channel, but now we're going back, way back. The farthest back I've ever gone. Back to a time when mirror balls, leisure suits, and the color brown were fashionable.
Love it.
The Space Invaders are a cornerstone of video game culture, and made Taito very rich way back when. Space Invaders was developed by Toshihiro Nishikado of the Taito Corporation. Taito was initially a vodka sales company, the first of its kind in Japan, and eventually remade itself as an amusement company in the late 60s, early 70s. When the video arcade industry was still emerging as an industry, Nishikado was responsible for many of their earlier hits, before being assigned to the Space Monsters project. He created the game entirely by himself over the course of a year. He designed the hardware, the software, the sprites, the sounds, everything. Nishikado claims he had all kinds of sources for inspiration. Target Shooting, Star Wars, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Atari's Breakout, among many others. The invaders have landed, and it's time to fight back. Sometimes I think there's this stereotyped idea that playing an arcade game is pressing buttons frantically like you're having a seizure. In my mind, you really can't play Space Invaders like that, at least not successfully. Every shot has to be made carefully, because the reload time is a killer. The game is challenging. I actually have a bit of a hard time beating a level or two, but it never feels unfair. So let's think of some ways Space Invaders was innovative. To my knowledge, it was the first video game that could save your high score, as long as the machine was kept on. And it was the first video game to get progressively more difficult as it went on. This actually wasn't intentional, it was a programming quirk. The more sprites cleared from the screen, the faster the game processes them. Nishikado kept it because he thought it made the game challenging. You could also argue that this game created, or at the very least defined, the shoot-'em-up genre. So you guys better be grateful. If by some chance you played Space Invaders in Japan in the 1970s, it probably looked a little something like this. This is what you would call the cocktail setup. It's a little table that you can look down into while you sit and play the game. I guess ideally while you sip at a beer.
Let's get some brewskis.
I love the design, but looking down like that might not be the best for your neck. Ah! You might see this cabinet in a few places in the US, but I don't think it ever caught on here like it did in Japan. If you played Space Invaders in the US at the time, the cabinet you played probably looked like this. This is the upright cabinet which was designed by Midway, who distributed the game in the US at the time. Taito wasn't a big enough company internationally to do it themselves. This was a pretty common practice at the time with Japanese companies. For instance, Midway also distributed Pac-Man on behalf of Namco. Using mirrors and a special backdrop, an illusion of the game having more color than it actually does is created. Can you imagine that way back in the late 70s, having a game display more than 2 colors was such a novelty? Some places would put a special cellophane over the screen to make it look like more colors were being displayed. If this may seem strange to you, this is a practice that actually goes back to the Magnavox Odyssey. I couldn't imagine wanting to see a game in color so badly that I would have to resort to this. It looks so tacky. It's like the video game equivalent of wearing lifts. You're not fooling anybody, wise guy. Makes you appreciate that Game Gear and Game Boy Color a little more, huh? Now, the footage I have here is from Space Invaders Deluxe and not actual cellophane on a cabinet. I simply don't have one I can pull out of my pants. So the game is a huge hit all over the world, it makes an unprecedented amount of money, and there's a demand for more Space Invaders. Space Invaders Part 2 is more of the same. It's essentially a reissue of the original game with an attract mode and a cutscene. People wanted a game in color so badly that a color version of Space Invaders could be marketed as a standalone game. The next few years would be silent until 1985 when we got Return of the Invaders, developed by UPL. This is Space Invaders Part 3, and the first real attempt to try and shake up things from the familiar. It plays very similarly to the first two games, but with more detail, color, and more elaborate enemy formations. Technically, it might be the best of the three games so far, but I still prefer Part 2. I think the developer, UPL, got too caught up in showing off and lost sight of what made the simple charm of the first two games so successful. Funnily enough, this one always felt forgettable to me, and I could never play it endlessly like I could the first two titles. It's not really bad, and the games that would come after would owe their existence to Return of the Invaders, but it's not really for me. Majestic 12, Space Invaders Part 4. What the hell is up with that overly elaborate title? Now we're talking. It took about 14 years, but now we have a sequel that feels not only like an expansion of the original, but also like the game designers were trying their hardest to move the series forward. Space Invaders Part 4 has a very ominous sound and look to it, and I just eat it up. It applies tropes that had emerged after the success of the original, such as giving the ship an extra hit point, bonus stages, and boss fights. The game looks great, it plays great, it's pretty challenging. It supports 2-player co-op, and with over 40 screens, when you get to the end, it feels like you completed a journey. In 1993, Taito released Space Invaders Deluxe for their Taito B-System arcade hardware. This cabinet collects the original version of Space Invaders, the color version, the cellophane version, and the midway version. It also introduced the competitive versus mode and a parody mode featuring other Taito characters. This was a pretty stealthy way of getting the original Space Invaders back in the arcade, while at the same time introducing new game modes. For the convenience of having several versions of the original game in one package, this is my preferred way of playing the original Space Invaders. In 1990, Taito released a Japan-only version of Space Invaders for the Game Boy. This release didn't have any extra bells and whistles. It was more or less the arcade experience in the palm of your hands. It's also, by my estimation, the hardest version of Space Invaders out there. 4 years later, Nintendo of America published their own version.
The ironically titled Space Invaders The Original Game is in fact not the original game, but a home version of Space Invaders Deluxe. This was released in Japan in 1994, but didn't make it to the US until 1997, when it was released as a budget title. Although, if you had the North American version of Game Boy Space Invaders, you could boot it up on your Super Game Boy.
So after years of re-releasing various versions of the original game, the next proper installment of the series was Space Invaders 95, Attack of the Lunar Loonies. Take the parody mode from Space Invaders Deluxe and take some cues from Space Invaders 91, add a charge laser attack, and you got Space Invaders 95. We're able to take command of classic Taito characters, like Sayo-chan, and whoever the hell this guy is.
Oh, what is this nonsense?
You're the manga depiction of poop.
What a bunch of crap.
I'm your girlfriend!
That's when you eat all them tricks.
For this sequel, Taito opted to take the Parodius approach. Is it Parodius or Parodius? I've never been entirely clear on that. In any case, what I'm trying to say is that this is a wacky parody game where you play as various Taito characters. The design of this game is nuts. The classic bump, bump, bump bass of the original has been replaced by a chant. And the level design takes the series to new territory. The combination of all this over-the-topness makes it my favorite game in the series. You really have to try it for yourself. The sad irony of Taito is despite the fact that they were a world-class arcade developer, they could never financially live up to their initial success.
Game over.
In the mid-90s and beyond, things started to slow down. Their North American division shut down due to a lack of sales, and from that point onward, they wouldn't publish their games internationally anymore. They would have to rely on other companies to get their games out. Their arcade development declined with them releasing fewer and fewer titles. In 2005-2006-ish, they were absorbed by Square Enix, which marks the end of classic Taito as we know it. By this point, most of the original staff had moved on to other companies. We had a few games under Square Enix. There was Space Invaders Get Even, which was on the Wii eShop, Space Invaders Extreme 2 for the DS, and Space Invaders Infinity Gene for the PS3 and Xbox 360. Space Invaders Infinity Gene tries to be like a bullet hell game and a classic arcade shoot-'em-up. It's this odd mishmash of two different gaming mentalities, but somehow it all gels together. It combines Space Invaders with Darwinist evolutionary theories and audio surf? We'll get to that in a moment. Space Invaders Infinity Gene is intentionally minimalistic and primitive in its design. It's trying to be like a game from the 70s. But at the same time a bullet hell game, like something you'd expect from Cave. As for the audio surf portions, you can import MP3s from your console to have the game generate levels based on whatever songs or sounds you select. The results vary, but it's neat to see what generates. Unfortunately, I can't show too much here because of copyright flags. Space Invaders Infinity Gene is really good, and I would definitely recommend buying it if you're a PS3 or 360 owner. It's not my favorite in the series, but I like it a lot. Now, most recently, we have Space Invaders Frenzy by Raw Thrills. Somebody had the crazy idea to take the classic Space Invaders and turn it into a Cabal shooter, like Dead Storm Pirates. And somehow it all works. The game is very fast-paced, but provides a fair challenge.
This is the best I've ever done in this. 500 tickets, really overwhelming.
It's really fun, but maybe it's a little overdone. It's not a full-fledged game. I wish it was. If they toned down the effects and just made it like a regular game, I think I'd be down.
So there's a look at most of the games in the Space Invaders franchise. There's a few I missed, like the Activision version. Who gives a shit about the Activision version? Space Invaders has a surprising amount of longevity for a series based on such a simple concept. The Invaders are part of pop culture, and really if they weren't, there wouldn't be a game culture to speak of. These guys go away for a few years, but they always find a way back. So we gotta grab our helmets or arcade sticks and get ready for the next invasion. Thanks again for watching. What's your favorite version of Space Invaders? Please let us know below. We're able to take command of classic Taito characters, like Sayo-chan. But where's Edie?